From Miami Law, I'm Annette Uguez, and this is The Explainer.
I think the biggest handicap, like so many plans in Washington, right, is how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? And that issue, as we know, runs along partisanship, and we'll see who will support these programs and that are willing to pass it. The plan as it stands will roll back corporate tax cuts, and it will increase the corporate tax rate to pay for everything. But I think this is something that should be non-negotiable, right? This plan will invest in very necessary improvements for the country, and corporations and billionaires should pay.
Welcome back to Season 6 of the Miami Law Explainer, the legal affairs podcast where Miami law experts lend context and historical relevance to today's headlines. The Biden administration's $2.2 trillion infrastructure plan promises to prioritize longstanding and persistent racial injustices by transitioning to a more democratic energy system, including in the electrical grid and public transit. Miami Law's Fredman Foundation practitioner in residence at the Environmental Justice Clinic, Abigail Fleming, walks us through the biggest obstacles to energy justice. Let's go to executive producer Catherine Skip with the interview.
Morning, Abigail. Nice to have you back.
Great to be here.
Let's start off with Biden's American Jobs Plan. It's dead on, I think, in ways to promote fairness across race and class lines. Could you talk a little about the big ticket line items?
Yeah, the plan does aim to get a lot done with a huge focus on jobs and the environment. So we're seeing environmentalists and labor groups across the country really hail this American Jobs Plan as a step in the right direction. But I think when faced with the climate crisis that is so vast and 4 years of inaction by the former administration, I think that Biden's plan, even though it is massive, it's still too small to make a real difference in reversing global warming. So you're seeing a lot of advocates asking for 4 times as much because really, and in my opinion as well, there's no such thing as too ambitious. We're in a crisis and we have been for a long time. So I think we need to set the bar a bit higher and then negotiate from there. Within his plan, Biden's looking to fix transportation infrastructure, deliver clean water to all Americans, renew the electric grid, get broadband internet access to everyone, and weatherize homes and buildings across the nation while also creating quality jobs and really revitalizing the manufacturing industry. I think one part of the plan that I want to highlight is just weatherization. Biden's talking about rehabilitating and really retrofitting affordable, accessible, energy efficient, and resilient housing. This process of protecting infrastructure from from the elements is vital for long-term resiliency. As I mentioned, we're in a climate crisis, and the science shows that climate change is already impacting low-income communities of color. Our current failing infrastructure is not prepared to face the effects of worsening natural disasters. And there's a growing divide between those who can weatherize their homes and those who don't have access to the tools or funds necessary to do so. Even here in Miami-Dade, based on community feedback, there's a huge desire within rental and low-income communities, predominantly Black and Brown communities, to weatherize their homes. This cannot Not only can weatherization protect in the event of a disaster, but it can also mitigate local carbon emissions, really thereby helping to alleviate the harshest consequence of global warming. In fact, the Environmental Justice Clinic here at Law has partnered with the Peer Group and Catalyst Miami, and we are assisting a community initiative to create a weatherization clinic. And the clinic will connect low-income households to existing weatherization programs, audit the programs to identify the barriers to weatherization, and really develop solutions to any barriers that are identified. So I think the Biden plan in regards to weatherization is right on point, and we're already seeing local activists latch onto that plan and really advocate for it.
Okay. It's a very lofty goal. Glad to see it. Is there something besides should be 4 times bigger missing from the plan? And do you think part of that has to do the ambitiousness that it already has is trying to get some part of it through?
Yeah, I definitely think, as I mentioned before, we need to go bigger and we need to invest more and we need to do that fast because we are in crisis. But I think the biggest handicap, like so many plans in Washington, right, is how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it? And that issue, as we know, runs along partisanship, and we'll see who will support these programs and that are willing to pass it. The plan, as it stands, will roll back corporate tax cuts and it will increase the corporate tax rate to pay for everything. But I think this is something that should be non-negotiable, right? This plan will invest in very necessary improvements for the country, and corporations and billionaires should pay. I mean, if we look at the facts, one study found in 2018 that only 91 Fortune 500 companies, or 91 Fortune 500 companies, paid zero in federal taxes on all U.S. income, and that's not right. But I also think there is support in this. I think it's interesting that we're seeing start to advocate for this. You're seeing people like Jeff Bezos, who created Amazon, has actually shown support for the plan, not in full form, but to some degree, because I think people are starting to understand that the plan would benefit everyone, including corporations that use the same roads and the same amenities that we all do, that need that solid infrastructure to help them make money. Um, I think this is, I'm not saying that there's not going to be arguments and disagreements as they're negotiating, but I think it sets out a great step forward, and I don't think we should go any smaller, regardless what others may be advocating for.
Mhm. Um, so I know that you mentioned broadband, which I don't know, to me is a huge issue of equity and equality, because if you have a very bright kid who's living 100 miles from a school that has AP classes and he doesn't have fast internet, he can't compete on the same level playing field. And you take that then to, like, farmers and manufacturers who can't compete in the marketplace because they don't have that same element. Your work is tied to holding governments accountable for the unfairnesses of the past, like building toxic incinerators or toxic wastewater ponds in neighborhoods that are really ill-equipped to fight back, or even to be brought in to be part of the conversation. Um, Kudos to you and your group of accountants. Um, is this a situation in Point, Florida, with the leaking 79-acre, 660 million gallon reservoir?
Absolutely. Piney Point, the former phosphate mining facility that leaked millions of gallons of wastewater near Tampa Bay, is just yet another example of the lax enforcement of environmental regulations. For decades, there has been numerous well-documented failures of the property's reservoir, causing human health and environmental disasters and incidents. As we're seeing evacuations, also deaths of employees, and the release of more than 1 billion gallons of contaminated wastewater. And the wastewater released contains heavy metals and pollutants. And it's going into the water and soil and impacting not only Manatee County, but the entire region. Um, and again, I think this Piney Point is going to serve as a moment of reckoning for the state. The phosphate industry should be held accountable and pay for the cleanup of Piney Point. Government officials should ensure the permanent closure of the site and hold the owners responsible for the cost of the cleanup. And this is something that can't be ignored. Central Florida is the phosphate capital of the world. The state produces 80% of the phosphate mined in the US. So this is something that Florida needs to get a hold of, and we need to have better enforcement of environmental regulations that were created to protect people and the environment, that the state has continued to remain complacent and failed to enforce. And again, no community should have to suffer this, and Florida needs to step up and hold those accountable, but also enforce the regulations that are there.
Is there also, I know the Governor DeSantis of Florida is talking about, stepping in enough, or does this really need federal oversight, like a Superfund site or something on that, much higher federal level that has more rigorous oversight, perhaps?
Yeah, I think this is something that Florida should have done a long time ago. And this is just, again, an example of Florida could have handled this. This was totally preventable. And it's sad that we are in a position now where we have to seek federal oversight. But again, I think this is something that Florida can handle and tackle. I think we are capable as a state of doing that. But again, we don't need to start, we don't want to react to the crisis. We want to prevent the crisis. So I think Florida needs to take a deep look at its enforcement mechanisms and start to hold owners and companies accountable to their pollution.
Hmm. Let's widen out a little. I sort of feel like where goes Florida, the rest of the country? It's like we're really good at kind of messing things up and then, trying to figure out a way to wiggle out. Um, so just looking at Florida, where do you see the most inequity, the most inequality when it comes to, energy justice, environmental justice? Kind of what's our big issue in Florida?
I, I don't think we have one big issue. I think right now, everyone, especially communities of color, are in crisis. Whether it's not having enough access to healthcare, not having access to excellent education. Our workers are underpaid and undervalued. And I think, when you combine that on top of the COVID pandemic, you're seeing the state of Florida really suffering. And again, this, more so impacts communities of color who don't necessarily, because of systemic racism, don't necessarily have the resources to respond. So I definitely want to shy away from picking one issue and one crisis, right? Because there's so many and they all intersect. And I think what is terrifying for many communities is as they continue to face the impacts of climate change, there's going to be massive displacement and just a massive reckoning for the state on how to combat the impacts of climate change, but also how to protect its people.
Hmm. And Florida is ground zero climate change. Like Florida will be impacted long before any other state in the country, I think.
Absolutely. I think when we're thinking about Florida, right, a peninsula that's already experiencing extreme heat waves, um, and that's already seeing extreme rise in sea levels. We're at the forefront of the climate crisis, and again, our elected officials need to take action. They need to work with communities. They need to create frameworks that shift power back to historically marginalized and oppressed communities by providing equitable access to benefits, by promoting empowered participation, and also advancing restorative protection from harms. Right? If we look at the history of policy and practices in the state, it has marginalized Black communities. We need to put the power back in the hands of those communities. And I think this can only happen with real structural and systemic change that's grounded in the unique history and culture and experiences of Black communities.
Hmm. Well, if we look at it at the micro level, especially in Miami, we're seeing historically Black communities that are on higher ground now being gentrified because that's the places where climate change is going to have the least impact in the next, three decades. So yeah, we are very much seeing that here. One last thing I wanted to ask you about. So we have the Great American Jobs Plan that hopefully will pass. What's the next piece that needs to come after that? You're saying more, more, more. Is there like American Jobs Plan 2, or are we dealing with or is the Biden administration more looking wholly at things where the infrastructure also addresses this, the jobs plan also, the rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement? So do you see the Biden administration as kind of knitting all of these pieces together with that one, far goal of being, energy efficient, having energy equality, kind of a whole cloth approach to these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think his plans ensure that communities of color are getting access to necessities and amenities they need to thrive, right? And he does want to build back better, but I think he's pushing on the bounds of what we consider infrastructure, right? And I think many of his plans interconnect all the social and economic issues, and they really are looking forward, right? And I think what's important now within the plan and through negotiations is whatever plan is decided upon in Washington, and whatever investment is chosen, right? However much dollars are, that they need to pick a framework, again, that shifts power back, that changes some of those structures and systemic practices that create the inequalities, right? So it can't just be about money, but it has to be about the framework with which this is going to be implemented. And I think we're going to see that slowly fleshed out through negotiations.
How much of that plan is rolling back the Trump era regulation? So I'm reading a lot about Bears Ears lately, but that's a separate legislation, even though it is sort of tied loosely to energy because it has to do with drilling rights?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. Bear Ears is a separate legislative issue. And yes, it is tied heavily to energy. Bear Ears is a national monument. It's an incredibly historic rock formation that's located in Utah. And it's home to a number of early human and Native American historical artifacts, and is just a sacred space for local indigenous tribes in the area. During the Obama administration, the site was protected, but the Trump administration began reviewing all national park designations over the past 20 years and began removing federal protection so that lands could be sold for oil and gas extraction. And that's exactly what happened to Bear Ears. President Trump reduced the Bear Ears monument size from 1.3 million acres to 200,000 acres. Tribes with a strong ancestral connection to Bears Ears, along with environmental groups, filed lawsuits seeking to reverse the decisions, arguing that Trump had overstepped his authority. And so those challenges are pending before federal judges in DC. The Trump administration made little effort to consult with paleontologists and other researchers when it shrank the monuments. So we're now seeing these groups asking Biden to restore the monument protections to sites that are so scientifically valuable. And regarding how this connects with the plan, I think Biden's plan, it looks to the future. I don't want people focusing on what it's rolling back, because again, like I mentioned earlier, the former administration was complacent and there was no progress. So I really think the jobs plan now, along with his other issues related to Bears Ears, we should be focusing on what they're bringing into the future, what they're bringing access to for Native Americans and communities of color. And again, we're wanting communities to have access to the necessities and the amenities they need to thrive.
Okay. I just love saying Bears Ears. It just makes me very happy.
Yeah, it's the best.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was fantastic. Nice being here.
All right. We'll catch you again next season. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us at The Explainer for a whole new season of interpreting legal issues in the headlines. If you love our show, leave us a 5-star review with your podcast provider and ask your friends to subscribe. You can always drop us a comment at explainer@miami.edu. Our show is engineered and edited by Christopher Alzadi, with theme music composed by Rady Kim from the Frost School of Music. I'm your host, Annette Uguez. Today's episode is brought to you by the Hoffman Forum's Civil Conversations series, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Art Museums and Universities. Similar Goals, Divergent Paths is the topic of the upcoming virtual event on April 26. For more information, visit law.miami.edu.